So today I'm going to be showing you how to make focaccia. So we're going to need 500 grams of strong bread flour. We're going to need 7 grams of instant yeast. We're going to use some salt, a whole bulb of garlic, some rosemary, some olive oil, and 400 milliliters of lukewarm water. We need to add the instant yeast into the lukewarm water. Now what this actually does is activate the yeast. Now with the lukewarm water, you want to make it slightly warmer to the touch, but not too warm, because what that will actually do is kill the yeast and you will not get a good rise. So just add it in, mix it round just so it can dissolve slightly. So give it a good old mix before you add it to the flour. So we're just trying to give the yeast a little bit of a helping hand, and that's why we don't use hot water, just lukewarm water. Just give it a bit of a stir around so it all mixes in. Don't worry if you get any on the sides, it really doesn't matter. We've got enough yeast in there. Some people add a bit of sugar, but I don't like that. Take a really good pinch of salt. Now it's probably about a tablespoon full of salt. I use coarse salt. Pop it into the bowl, into your flour. You can add more, but it's really personal preference. We're going to add 2 tablespoons of olive oil. Doesn't matter which olive oil. You can use a flavoured olive oil, you can use a chili olive oil, you can use a garlic olive oil, garlic infused olive oil. It's really, this is how you can adapt your focaccia. So we're just going to pop that into the bowl, and now it's time to add our water. Now I said 400 milliliters of lukewarm water. Start adding it slowly. Add about half first of all, so you can actually see the mixture come together. You may need more than 400 milliliters, and you may need less. It really does depend on the flour and how it comes together. But what we're ideally looking for is quite a wet texture. This is where focaccia differs from other breads. Other breads, you need a firm dough that you're going to start off with, and you're going to be able to knead that. But the beauty of this recipe is that it needs very little kneading. So look, I'm adding a little bit more here because, as you can see, I've already added half of my water and yeast mixture, and I'm just giving it a bit of a mix here, trying to incorporate that flour in with the yeasty water and just mixing it all the way around, bringing together that flour from the outside, bringing it in, and you can kind of eyeball how much you want. At this particular moment, it's far too dry, so we know that we're going to need to add a little bit more of that water mixture. I will say with focaccia, more is better than less. If you add too much water, you can always add a little bit more flour. But what we're looking for is quite a loose dough, not a dough that you can knead, because you need to be able to create these huge air pockets in the focaccia, and that is exactly why we're doing this. Focaccia is famous for those huge air pockets. Now, I clearly needed a little bit more water, so I'm just adding just that tad bit more water in. And as you can see, it's all coming together and it's starting to form into this very glutinous, this very stringy type dough. We don't want a tight dough. We want a very loose dough. I'm just going to take my rings off here because you shouldn't actually handle dough with any rings because it gets far too messy. So here we go. It's now the fun part where we have to get our hands messy. There's no avoiding this, and we're just going to have to go in. And so we're taking the dough from the outside of the bowl and we're just bringing it forward and just playing with that a little bit. What we're doing is we're trying to activate that yeast and loosen up the glutens in the flour. You don't have to be heavy-handed with this. We're just bringing it all together so we get a very sticky dough. And what we're doing is we're pulling up the dough and we're folding it back on itself very loosely, creating more air. So we're going to get a really good rise on this. We're just literally pulling it up, popping it down, and we're pulling it up, popping it down. So we're trying to manipulate that dough without actually kneading it by putting more air into the dough, but without being too rough with it. We don't want to knead it because this is a no-knead bread. It's that simple. It is such an easy bread to make. It does get quite sticky, I'm afraid, but all you're doing is trying to incorporate the flour into that yeast water mixture. So we're just literally creating it and playing around with it. We're stretching it, we're folding it, and we're creating a big mess, but it's going to be a delicious mess. I promise you that. And once it's actually done its first rise, you will see exactly why we use the lukewarm water with the yeast and why we put these air pockets where we're stretching it and pulling it back, because it's going to give us a really stringy, glutinous rise. And that is exactly what we're looking for in a focaccia. So just keep doing this, keep pulling it up and folding it over, making those glutinous strands even more stringy. And we're bringing the dough from the side of the bowl into the middle and folding it over, creating more air into the dough. Yes, it's messy. Yes, it's sticky. But you know what? It's also quite fun to do. The beauty of this recipe is that this is really the only fiddly bit in the recipe. It's plain sailing from here on in. So we need another bowl because the bowl that we've been using is far too dirty. So we're just going to put a little bit of olive oil in the new bowl and we're just going to spread it around on the bottom of the bowl. And that then helps the focaccia to not really stick too much. It also adds a little bit of olive oil, extra olive oil, into the mixture as well. So we're just going to plonk that into the new bowl. Doesn't really have to be gentle, doesn't really have to be neat. Try and get as much of the dough off your fingers into the bowl. As I said, it is a sticky mess, but it is an absolutely delicious sticky mess. That's the hard part over and done with. We need to add a tiny little bit of olive oil. Just drizzle the olive oil on top of the dough, and this is going to help it not become crusty. And what we need to do now is we need to leave it for about 1 to 2 hours. Now I say 1 to 2 hours, it all depends where you're going to leave your dough to rest, because that's important. If you're going to leave it in a warm place, in a windowsill for example, that's quite sunny, then you're probably going to need to leave it for just over an hour. But what we're looking for is a dough that has risen and doubled in size. If you haven't got anywhere warm, maybe an airing cupboard or a proving drawer, if some people have, I don't, it may well take 2 hours. But what we're looking for is this dough needs to be doubled in size. So we just leave it and just take a peek every now and again and just see how it's going on. You could do this the night before and leave it in your fridge. I personally don't like to do that because I think it doesn't taste quite as nice as if you do it in one day. But 1 to 2 hours depending on where you leave it and the temperature of the area that you leave it on. And what we really need to do is just pop over a clean tea towel and just let it rest for 1 to 2 hours. It's time to check on our dough, and it's been resting for about 2 hours in a nice warm place. And as you can see, it is more than doubled inside. Just look at that jiggle. Oh, it's full of air pockets, it's very stringy and glutinous, and it's time now to put the dough into a baking tray with high edges. I have filled the baking tray with parchment paper just so it doesn't stick to the bottom. You can use any size and shape baking tray that you want really, so long as it has a little bit of depth to it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of olive oil just so the dough doesn't stick to the parchment paper once it is cooked. But the most important thing to do with this one is to make sure that you spread the olive oil around all of the base and including the sides, especially in the corners. We do not want our focaccia to stick. And because it's quite a wet dough, we don't want it to stick once it's baked. So just make sure that you get in all the crevices and the creases and that you pay attention to the sides and just spread that olive around as much as you can. Get your hands in there and just try and get every single bit of parchment paper, baking paper covered. So it is time to put our dough into the pan. So just try and be as gentle as you can. You don't want to knock those air bubbles out, but can you see how stringy and glutinous that dough has become? You want to just gently prise the dough from the side of the bowl and try and get as much as that dough mixture into the pan. It should be quite simple actually because it's so stringy and glutinous. So we want to just fold over very gently onto itself, and then you fold over again very gently, and then we're trying to flip it over. Okay, yeah, it does stick a little bit, but because you've put the olive oil on there, it should easily, once you've manhandled it a little bit, come away. And what we're looking to do is spread out that dough as much as you can, very, very gently, to try and get it into whatever shape your pan is. We're trying to stretch it, so when we go for our second proof, which is the most important part, we're going to make sure that that dough rises and spreads into the pan. And just like the first proof, this is going to go crazy and it's going to double in size. Once you have stretched it into position, you are then going to leave it once again in a nice warm place to prove for a second time for around about 1 to 2 hours. And again, you're looking for it to double in size. For this recipe, I'm going to be doing roasted garlic and rosemary, and it's time to roast the garlic. So just get some foil, and we want a whole bulb of garlic. We just simply take off the top, just the very, very top, so you can just see the bulbs poking through. And what we're going to do is we're going to put some olive oil on, just a very, very small amount, a drizzle of olive oil onto the garlic bulb. And we want a sprinkling of salt. This needs to be roasted in the oven for around about 220 degrees C or 200 fan, gas mark 7 or 425 Fahrenheit for around about an hour. We can use the residual heat of the cooker to actually help our second proof. So if you just pop the focaccia dough on top of the oven, win-win situation. Our dough's been proving for 2 hours, and as you can see, it's doubled in size. It's got a lovely wiggle to it. Can you see the beautiful air pockets that we've got? And that's exactly what we're looking for in a focaccia. So we're just going to pop this to the side and we're going to put our toppings on. Now, we're using rosemary and the roasted garlic that we made earlier. Because it's been proving for 2 hours, the roasted garlic has cooled down enough for you to be able to handle it. So we're just going to squidge those garlic cloves out of the bulb. They should be easy to actually get out. But you don't have to do garlic and rosemary. There is so many different flavour combinations that you can actually put on top of this focaccia. I have previously done cheese, strong cheese with jalapeno peppers. That was delicious. You can do thyme, fresh thyme or dried thyme. It doesn't have to be fresh. You don't have to use fresh rosemary in this one either. You can use dried rosemary, dried thyme. I mean, lemon thyme is beautiful. If you do the dried or fresh thyme with some lemon zest, you can actually put that in the olive oil before you actually make your dough, so it actually infuses within the actual dough itself. You can do cherry tomatoes, just half them and put them on the top. You can do sun-dried tomatoes. You could do roasted onions, which are delicious with this focaccia. Really use your imagination. You don't have to do rosemary and roasted garlic. But for this recipe, we are doing the rosemary, and it's very important to make sure that your rosemary is slightly oiled or they're going to burn. We do not want a bitter sprig of rosemary. So we're just going to take a few sprigs of rosemary. We also don't want to overpower the focaccia because rosemary has a tendency to be quite soapy. So I'm using about a finger length of rosemary on top of this focaccia. So just take the needles off the sprig of rosemary, and then before you actually put them onto the dough, we're going to just lightly dip our fingers into the olive oil to make sure that your fingers are oily, because otherwise they're going to stick to that dough, but also to coat those little needles of rosemary so they don't burn in the oven. So just sprinkle them on top of the focaccia dough. What we want to do is we want to try and get most of the focaccia covered with a little bit of rosemary. You don't really want a bite of focaccia without actually tasting the flavour of rosemary and garlic. Just make sure each rosemary needle has a tiny bit of olive oil just to prevent it from burning. And just gently spread it around as evenly as you can. Now's the fun bit. We're going to dip our fingers to make sure they're nice and oily into that olive oil, and it's time to handle and get those air pockets and squidge it. So you just pop in your fingers into that dough to try and manipulate it, and we're just creating little dimples in that dough. I know it looks like you're knocking all the air out, but this is exactly what you want. We're going to add some sea salt, some coarse sea salt onto the top, and I almost forgot to put the actual roasted garlic on there. So take your roasted garlic and just try and pop it in to the little holes that you've made. You don't have to spread the garlic out too much because we've already cooked it. We've taken away the bitterness of that garlic, and by roasting it, we've added the sweetness to the garlic itself. You can use fresh garlic, just make sure it's chopped up really well and popped into those air pockets that we've created with our fingers. But for this recipe, we're using the roasted garlic, so it adds that beautiful sweetness to it. Just pop it all over the top. Now what we're going to do is we're going to roast this in the oven for 220 or 200 fan, which is gas mark 7, 425 Fahrenheit, for about 20 to 25 minutes. And just look at this beauty. Your focaccia is done. How beautiful does that look? Now you can eat this straight from the oven and it will be delicious. You can eat it cold. It really doesn't matter. And it goes really well with some olive oil and a little bit of balsamic. Just have a dip in that. It is absolutely gorgeous, and I hope that you've enjoyed my very first video of my focaccia recipe.